Justin looked me straight in the eyes while he distractedly swirled the red wine in his glass, sitting in that small, upscale bistro tucked away in a quiet corner of downtown Chicago. There wasn't a hint of shame in his voice, only a kind of brutal, calculated honesty that made my blood run cold for a split second. He explained that Tiffany was back in town and that their chance encounter a few days earlier had reawakened something he thought was buried forever under the weight of our wedding preparations. With a calmness that seemed almost inhuman to me, he proposed a break. He wanted to stay with her for an entire month at his family's lake house in Michigan, to live out that daily life they had cut short years ago, just to be absolutely certain that I was the right choice before he tied himself to me for the rest of his life. He asked me to stay behind and wait for him in our apartment, in silence, as if my existence were a book to be put on pause on a shelf while he wrote another chapter with his ex-girlfriend. It was in that moment, as the dim lights of the restaurant cast long shadows over his complacent face, that I understood the true depth of his arrogance. He was treating me like an option, a safety net ready to catch him if his leap into the past ended in a crash. I didn't scream, and I didn't shed a single tear in front of him. I looked at him with a coldness I didn't know I possessed and simply replied that he could go, that I would give him all the time he needed. But in the secret of my heart, while he smiled in relief, I knew that this month wouldn't be his test for the future, but the beginning of his complete erasure from my life. While he was planning his romantic getaway, I was already drawing up the blueprint for my freedom, ready to dismantle piece by piece the world we had built together, leaving him with nothing but the void his presumption deserved. Hello to all of you, my dear friends. My name is Sarah, and today, at 63 years old, I look back on this story with the serenity of someone who has won their most difficult battle. But at the time, I was a young woman about to hand over her entire future into the wrong hands. Before I tell you how I managed to transform that humiliation into my greatest victory, I ask you to support this channel. If you like these stories of redemption and dignity, please leave a like on this video and subscribe. I would also love to know where you are listening from and if you have ever had to face a moment where someone tried to treat you like a plan B. Please write it in the comments, because your strength feeds mine. It was 1991, and Chicago was wrapped in that thick, damp autumn chill that makes the skyscrapers look like they're disappearing into the clouds. The wind off Lake Michigan was biting, turning the streets into tunnels of whistling air. I was working as an architect at a renowned firm, and my life seemed to be moving along on a perfect track. Justin was a rising lawyer, a man who loved order and precision, but who hid a massive ego behind a reassuring smile. We had been together for 4 years, and our wedding was just around the corner. We had already chosen everything: the invitations printed on expensive cream-colored cardstock, the catering menu, even the specific arrangements for the church. The apartment we lived in was my pride and joy. I had renovated it myself, overseeing every single detail, from the crown moldings on the high ceilings to the selection of the granite for the kitchen counters. It was our nest, or at least, that's what I believed. That night at dinner, however, the atmosphere was different. Justin hadn't asked me anything about my day and seemed impatient, tapping his fingers on the white tablecloth. When he finally brought up Tiffany's name, I felt a sharp knot in my stomach. Tiffany had been his big college passion, the woman who had left him to pursue a career in New York, leaving him with a broken heart. Justin had spoken of her to me as a distant memory, a ghost that no longer had any power over him. But seeing him so agitated at the mere thought that she was back in the city made me realize he had been lying to me for years, or perhaps he had been lying to himself. He told me she had contacted him and they had met for a quick coffee. That coffee had turned into a confession of doubts and regrets. She had proposed that they spend some time together to see if that broken link could be mended. And Justin, instead of turning her away out of respect for our commitment, had decided that I should be his insurance policy. He explained his perverse logic to me. If he went with her for a month and realized it didn't work, he would come back to me even more convinced of our love. He wanted me to stay there, to keep the home fires burning, to take care of the wedding errands, and to play the part of the faithful fiancé waiting for the verdict. He told me it was a gesture of honesty toward me because he didn't want to marry me while having a doubt. In reality, it was the most selfish act I had ever endured. He was asking me for permission to officially cheat on me, with the promise of returning if the other option turned out to be a disappointment. As he paid the check, I watched him with an almost clinical detachment. I no longer saw the man I was supposed to marry, but a mediocre stranger who didn't deserve even a minute of my pain. We walked out of the restaurant, and the Chicago cold slapped my face. We walked under the glow of the streetlights, and the sound of our footsteps felt like a countdown. Justin was already talking about how he would organize that month, what excuses we would make to our families. I didn't answer. I looked at the dark windows of the closed shops and the yellow lights reflected on the wet pavement, and I felt a sense of absolute clarity. The Sarah who accepted compromises died in that restaurant. We got home, and he immediately started packing a suitcase. He was almost euphoric, an excitement he tried to mask with a fake concern for me. He told me to call him only for emergencies because he needed space to think. He asked me not to change anything, to leave his books on the desk and his clothes in the closet, because he wanted to feel like his place was still there when he returned. I watched him fold his blue shirts, the ones I had picked out for him myself, and I felt a wave of nausea. He didn't understand that he was destroying everything. He truly thought that love was a contract that could be suspended and resumed at will. When he was finished, he turned to me and tried to hug me. I stepped away delicately, using a sudden exhaustion as an excuse. He didn't insist. He gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek and walked out the door, dragging his suitcase down the hallway. The sound of the door closing was the sweetest sound I had heard in months. I was alone in my apartment. I sat on the floor in the middle of the hallway and stayed there for an indefinite amount of time. The silence was incredibly heavy. Then, slowly, I stood up. I went to the cabinet in the hallway where I kept the house documents. I knew Justin wasn't a man who paid attention to bureaucratic details. He had always trusted my management. I pulled out the file for the lease-to-own contract. My father had signed it as a guarantor, but the lease was in my name only. The monthly payments, the initial down payment, everything came from my savings and the trust fund my grandmother had left me. Justin contributed to the living expenses, but he had no legal right to those walls. He was a guest in my world, a guest who had just decided to leave. I went into the bedroom and opened the closet. Seeing it half empty and half full of his clothes made me furious. I took a large black trash bag and started throwing in everything that belonged to him: socks, underwear, the silk ties he loved so much. But then I stopped. No, throwing them away would be too simple. I had to be more methodical. I had to act like the architect I was, dismantle to rebuild. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk and started making a list in a notebook. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every rug. I remembered exactly who had paid for what. Most of the furnishings had been bought by me or given to me by my family. Justin had bought the large stereo system and the leather chair in the office, nothing else. He had preferred to spend his money on trips and expensive dinners, leaving me with the burden of building our nest. It was a fatal mistake for him. Around 4 a.m, I picked up the landline and dialed Megan's number. I knew she was awake. She had always been a night owl. When she answered, my voice was steady, without a tremor. I told her everything, without omitting a single detail of Justin's infamy. Megan stayed silent for a long moment, then uttered just one word: destroy him. She didn't mean physically, she meant socially and morally. She told me she would help me empty everything, that she knew an antique dealer who would buy the furniture in bulk, and that her cousin, who worked for a moving company, could do the heavy lifting in a single day. The next morning, the first light of dawn entered the apartment, revealing the dust and small imperfections I had never noticed before. I felt strange, almost euphoric. It was the adrenaline rush of someone who knows they have nothing left to lose. I made myself a coffee and sat on the balcony overlooking the train tracks and the gray rooftops of Chicago. I knew Justin had already arrived at the lake house. Tiffany was probably with him at that very moment. I imagined their breakfast, their talks about destiny and second chances. It made me want to laugh. While he was trying to find himself in the arms of another, I was about to make him disappear from the face of the earth, at least as far as my life was concerned. The first step was to call my architecture firm. I knew they were looking for someone to lead a massive restoration project in Austin, Texas, a 2-year assignment that no one wanted to take because of the bureaucratic complexity. I called the principal partner and told him I was available to leave immediately. He was thrilled. He gave me a week to organize the move. That phone call was the final confirmation that fate was just waiting for my signal to get back in motion. In the following days, the apartment became a site of liberation. Megan came over every evening after work. Together, we started packing up everything that was mine: the books, the records, the ceramics I had collected so carefully. Every box closed was a weight off my heart. Justin sent me a short message through a mutual friend to ask how I was doing, avoiding calling me directly. I replied with a dry, "All good, don't worry." He interpreted it as the silence of a submissive woman waiting for his return. He couldn't imagine that this silence was the vacuum that was about to swallow him whole. I heard from Tiffany's sister, a contact Megan had, that Justin was bragging about his situation. He was telling friends that he had been honest with me and that I had understood his need for clarity. He said I was an exceptional woman for my patience. Hearing those words made me realize how little he had ever really known me. It wasn't patience on my part, it was the quiet that precedes total demolition. On Thursday, Megan's cousin arrived with the truck. In just a few hours, the living room that had been the center of our social life was transformed into a bare room. I sold the sofa, the dining table, and the chairs to the dealer Megan had introduced me to. He gave me cash immediately, a considerable sum that I would use for the deposit on a new place in Austin. When the movers took away the last rug, I stood there looking at the marks the furniture legs had left on the floor. They were like scars that were finally healing. All that was left was Justin's stuff. I didn't want to take it with me, but I didn't want it to stay in that house either. I decided to do something that many would call cruel, but that I considered pure efficiency. I called his mother, Barbara. Barbara was a woman of another era, rigid and obsessed with appearances. When I told her that Justin had decided to take a break to be with Tiffany, I heard her breath hitch on the other end of the line. I told her that since he no longer lived here, I would be sending all of his things to her house via a courier. I didn't give her time to protest. By Friday morning, the apartment was completely empty. There were no curtains, no pictures, no memories. There was only the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the white walls. It was an image of devastating beauty. I had erased 4 years of life in less than a week. I felt powerful, as if I had retaken the reins of a carriage that was about to plunge off a cliff. Before leaving for the last time, I went into the kitchen. I opened the drawer where I kept the notepads and tore off a sheet. I took a pen and wrote a few words in my clearest, most professional handwriting. I didn't want insults. I didn't want long explanations. I only wanted him to understand the scale of his mistake. I folded the paper and taped it to the glass of the front door, right at eye level. I knew it would be the first thing he would see when he returned, if he ever managed to get in. I left the apartment and handed the keys to the landlord, explaining that I had decided to terminate the lease early and that he could keep the security deposit as compensation. He was surprised, but seeing my determination, he didn't ask questions. I walked toward Union Station with a single suitcase, the same one I had arrived with in this city years ago. The train south was waiting on the platform. As I climbed the steps of the carriage, I didn't look back at the Sears Tower or the skyline. My gaze was fixed forward, toward a city that knew nothing about me and where I could finally be the sole and only protagonist of my own story. The journey had just begun, and the feeling of the train's metal vibrating under my feet was the beat of a new heart starting to pump life back into my veins, far from the shadow of a man who thought he could turn me off with a simple whim. The rhythm of the train tracks beneath me was a steady, percussive reminder that every mile gained was a piece of my old life left behind. I watched through the scratched window as the industrial outskirts of Chicago gave way to the vast, open stretches of the Midwest. The sky was a bruised purple, matching the exhaustion that was finally starting to seep into my bones. But it was a good kind of tired. It was the fatigue of a builder who had just finished a necessary demolition. Justin was likely sitting on a deck in Michigan right now, looking out at the lake and feeling incredibly proud of himself for his honesty. He probably imagined me sitting in our living room, staring at the phone, wondering when he would call. He had no clue that the living room didn't even exist anymore. I had spent the last 6 days moving with a surgical precision that would have made my architectural mentors proud. I wasn't just leaving a man, I was dismantling a false reality. Every action I had taken since he walked out that door was a brick in a new wall I was building, a wall that he would never be able to climb. As the train hummed southward toward Texas, my mind kept drifting back to the morning after he left. I had woken up at 5, the apartment feeling strangely hollow without the sound of his heavy breathing. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't put on the music he liked. I simply sat at the kitchen island with my notebook and a cup of black coffee. I looked at the granite countertops I had picked out, the ones he had bragged about to his lawyer friends as if he'd been the one to spend weeks searching through stone yards. That was the first thing that hit me. So much of our shared life was actually just my labor being presented under his name. I opened my wedding binder, the one I had spent months meticulously organizing, and I felt a surge of cold, clear energy. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like a general preparing for a counteroffensive. The first call I made was to the catering company. We had put down a significant deposit for a high-end dinner for 200 people. The woman on the other end was sympathetic when I told her I needed to cancel. She explained the forfeiture policy, but I didn't care about the money we were losing. I cared about the ties I was cutting. Next was the florist, then the photographer, and then the church. With every cancellation confirmed, I felt a physical weight lifting off my chest. I wasn't just canceling a party, I was unmaking a cage. I remember the florist asking if I wanted to reschedule, and I simply said, "No, the occasion has ceased to exist." It was the most honest thing I had said in years. By noon, the wedding that was supposed to define my future had been reduced to a pile of voided contracts and a few $100s in returned deposits that I funneled directly into my personal savings account. Then came the harder part, the physical space. I called a local antique dealer who specialized in mid-century modern pieces. I knew him from my work at the firm. He arrived 2 hours later, looking around the apartment with a practiced, appreciative eye. I pointed to the dining set, the handcrafted sideboard, the designer lamps, and the rugs. "I'm moving to a furnished studio in Texas," I told him, "and I need it all gone by Wednesday." He didn't ask questions. He offered me a lump sum in cash that was significantly less than what the pieces were worth, but I didn't hesitate. I needed the speed more than I needed the profit. Watching those men carry out the table where we had shared hundreds of dinners felt like watching a movie being erased. I realized then that objects only have the meaning we give them, and I had officially stripped those objects of their power. Closing the joint bank account was a different kind of hurdle. I walked into the bank on LaSalle Street, the same branch where we had opened the account 3 years ago with such hope. I remember Justin telling the teller that we were building our empire. What a joke that seemed now. Since I was the one who had funded the vast majority of the account with my grandmother's inheritance, the bank manager had no problem following my instructions. I left with a cashier's check for the full balance, leaving only the exact amount of Justin's last 3 paychecks in the account. I wasn't a thief, but I wasn't a martyr either. I was simply taking back what was mine. As I walked out into the crisp Chicago air, the check tucked safely in my wallet, I felt a sense of financial autonomy that I hadn't realized I had lost. I was no longer a partner in someone else's empire. I was the sole proprietor of my own life. The most satisfying part of that week, though, was the Justin box. Megan came over on Tuesday night with 3 cases of cheap beer and a roll of industrial-strength trash bags. We didn't talk much at first. We just worked. We went through the closets, the bathroom cabinets, and the hall storage. Everything that was his expensive suits, his law books, his stupid collection of vintage watches, and even his favorite coffee mug, went into boxes. Megan was the one who suggested the moving company. "Don't just leave it in the hallway," she said. "Make sure it lands on Barbara's doorstep. Let his mother deal with the mess he made." We spent the evening packing his life into cardboard containers. It was a bizarrely cathartic experience. As I taped the last box shut, I realized that 4 years of a man's presence could be reduced to 12 medium-sized boxes. It made his need for space seem almost comical. He wanted space? I was giving him the entire world, minus me. Megan's cousin, who owned a small moving van, arrived on Thursday morning. We loaded the boxes and the few pieces of furniture that were strictly Justin's. I gave him the address to Justin's parents' house in the suburbs. I also handed him a small sealed envelope with a short note inside. It wasn't a love letter or a letter of hate. It was a bill. I had calculated the remaining utilities and the final rent payment for his portion of the month. I knew Barbara would be the one to open it, and I knew the shame of it would eat her alive. Barbara was a woman who valued class above all else, and her son being billed for his own departure was a blow she wouldn't be able to ignore. Megan squeezed my hand as the van pulled away. "You're a legend, Sarah," she whispered. I didn't feel like a legend. I just felt like someone who was finally cleaning a very dirty room. The final meeting with the landlord was the last piece of the puzzle. I had lived in that building since before I met Justin. He had moved in with me, and I had never bothered to put him on the lease. It was one of those small oversights that turned out to be a godsend. I told the landlord that I was accepting a job in Texas and needed to break the lease early. I offered to let him keep the security deposit and explained that the apartment would be professionally cleaned and empty by Friday afternoon. He was a decent man, and he knew I had always been a good tenant. He accepted the deal without a fight. When he asked where Justin was, I simply said he decided he needed a different kind of living arrangement. It wasn't a lie. The train began to slow down as we crossed into a new state, the landscape shifting from the flat plains to something more rugged. I looked at my hands and noticed that the indentation from my engagement ring was already starting to fade. It was a small physical sign of healing. I thought about the job waiting for me in Austin. It was a senior position at a firm that specialized in sustainable urban design, something I had always been passionate about but had sidelined because Justin thought it wasn't prestigious enough. He wanted me to stay in Chicago, working on high-rise condos for people who didn't care about architecture, just so he could brag about my firm's name at his firm's holiday parties. In Austin, I would be Sarah the architect, not Sarah the lawyer's fiancé. My arrival in Austin was a shock to the senses. The heat was the first thing that hit me. A dry, insistent warmth that felt like a hug after the cold dampness of Chicago. I took a taxi to the small, furnished studio I had rented, sight unseen near the university. It was a far cry from the luxury loft I had just left. The floors were linoleum, the furniture was mismatched, and the kitchen was the size of a closet. But as I closed the door and dropped my suitcase on the bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. There was no one here to tell me the art on the walls wasn't sophisticated enough. There was no one to complain that I spent too much time in the studio. I was the master of these few square feet, and that was enough. I spent my first evening in Austin sitting on the small balcony, listening to the crickets and watching the fireflies. The air smelled of cedar and dust. I pulled out my new Texas phone, a clunky Motorola that I had bought specifically so Justin wouldn't have my number. I called Megan. She told me the news from Chicago was explosive. Justin had returned from his Michigan test exactly as planned, apparently because Tiffany had already started seeing someone else behind his back. He had arrived at the apartment with a bouquet of flowers and a bottle of expensive champagne, only to find that his key didn't work. The landlord had told him the apartment was vacant and that Sarah was gone. Megan said he had been seen sitting on the curb, surrounded by the boxes his mother had driven over in a fit of rage, looking like a man who had just realized he'd played a game he didn't even understand. Hearing about his confusion didn't give me the thrill I thought it would. Instead, I felt a profound sense of closure. Justin's suffering was his own creation, a natural consequence of his belief that people were chess pieces he could move at will. I told Megan about my new studio and the view of the Texas hills. I told her about the smell of the air and the way the light hit the buildings here. We laughed about the wedding binder being in a Chicago dumpster. For the first time in years, I wasn't talking about our plans or our future. I was talking about mine. The next morning, I walked into my new office. It was a converted warehouse with high ceilings and open desks filled with people who looked like they actually enjoyed what they were doing. My new boss, a woman named Elena, who had a reputation for being brilliant and uncompromising, welcomed me with a firm handshake. "Glad you're here, Sarah," she said. "We've got a lot of work to do." She didn't ask about my personal life. She didn't care that I had just uprooted my entire existence. She only cared about my vision and my skills. I spent the day looking at site plans for a new community center, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As I walked home that evening, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I realized that the break Justin wanted was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. He had intended it to be a way to keep me in check, a way to ensure I knew my place as his second choice. Instead, it had been the catalyst for my own awakening. I had spent 4 years trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine, trying to be the perfect accessory for a man who didn't even see me. Now, the mold was broken. I was an architect in a new city, with a new phone number and a new sense of purpose. I stopped at a small taco stand on my way back to the studio and ate dinner on a park bench. I watched the students and the families walking by, feeling a strange, wonderful sense of belonging to myself. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't worrying about someone else's ego. I was just Sarah, sitting in the Texas twilight, eating a taco and feeling the warmth of the pavement under my feet. The silence of the night wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities. I thought about the note I had left on the door in Chicago. I hoped Justin had read it carefully. I hoped he understood that you can't put a human soul on pause and expect it to be there when you decide to press play. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in years. I didn't dream about the loft, or the wedding, or the gray Chicago sky. I dreamed about buildings made of light and glass, about structures that breathed with the landscape. When I woke up the next morning, the Texas sun was streaming through my window, and I knew that the demolition was over. It was time to start building. I looked at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror and smiled. The woman staring back at me didn't look like a victim. She looked like a survivor who had just found her true north. I spent the weekend exploring Austin on foot. I walked through the parks, visited the local libraries, and sat in the coffee shops, soaking in the atmosphere of the city. Everywhere I went, I felt a sense of freedom that was almost dizzying. I was no longer defined by a relationship or a social circle. I was just a person in a city, and that was incredibly liberating. I started a new notebook, not a wedding binder this time, but a sketchbook for my own designs. I drew the lines of the hills, the shapes of the trees, and the shadows of the buildings. I was reclaiming my creativity, piece by piece. By Sunday evening, I felt ready for whatever the week would bring. I had survived the worst of the betrayal and the chaos of the move. I had successfully disappeared from a life that was stifling me and reappeared in one that promised growth. I knew that Justin would probably try to find me, that he would send letters or try to reach out through mutual friends. But I also knew that it wouldn't matter. He was a character in a story I had finished reading. I was on to the next chapter, and the pages were blank and beautiful. I turned off the light in my small studio and looked out at the city lights. I was Sarah. I was an architect, and I was finally, truly free. The break was over, and my real life was just beginning. I didn't need to look back at the rubble of Chicago to know I had made the right choice. Every breath of the warm Texas air was a confirmation. I was no longer a backup plan. I was the architect of my own happiness, and the foundation I was building now was made of something much stronger than Justin's hollow promises. It was made of my own resilience, my own talent, and my own unwavering dignity. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I knew exactly where I was going, and I was going there on my own terms. The silence of the night was no longer a threat. It was my sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, I was finally finding the voice I had lost for so long. The future was waiting, and I was ready to meet it head-on, with my eyes open and my heart finally, truly settled. Those first few weeks in Austin passed with a speed that felt almost supernatural, as if time itself were trying to make up for all the years I had spent standing still in Chicago. The Texas heat was a constant, heavy presence, but I welcomed it. It felt like it was baking the old, tired version of me right out of my skin. Every morning, I would wake up in my small, sun-drenched studio, listen to the distant hum of traffic on I-35, and feel a surge of gratitude that was so strong it almost made me dizzy. There were no suits to dry clean, no social calendars to manage for Justin's firm, and no subtle, biting comments about my choice of shoes or the way I styled my hair. I was a ghost in Chicago, but in Austin, I was becoming a person again. However, even with 1,500 miles between us, the loose ends of my old life were still twitching. I knew Megan was handling things back home with the precision of a master strategist, but I also knew that the final confrontation with Justin's world was inevitable. It wasn't just him I had to leave behind. It was the entire structure of expectations his family had built around me. The first real test came during my second week at the new firm. I was deep into a set of site plans when the receptionist told me there was a woman on the line who refused to give her name but said it was a family emergency. My heart skipped a beat, thinking of my father, but as soon as I picked up the receiver, I knew it wasn't him. The silence on the other end was cold and expensive. Then came the voice. It was Barbara, Justin's mother. She didn't start with a greeting or a question. She started with a command. "Sarah, you need to come home and stop this ridiculous charade right now," she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of suburban authority that used to make me shrink. She told me that Justin was a mess, that he wasn't sleeping, and that the scandal of the moving boxes arriving at her house was becoming the talk of their country club. She spoke as if I were a rebellious child who had run away from home, rather than a 28-year-old woman who had been betrayed by her fiancé. I sat there in my office in Austin, looking out at the bright Texas sky, and I realized I didn't feel the usual knot of guilt in my stomach. I felt nothing but a calm, professional distance. I told Barbara very clearly that there was no charade to stop. I explained that Justin had made a choice to explore his feelings for another woman, and I had simply made the choice to explore my own future elsewhere. When she tried to tell me that Justin was just confused and that men do these things before they settle down, I almost laughed. I told her that if he was confused, he should use the space he asked for to figure it out, but he would have to do it without me. She then tried to bring up the furniture I had sold, calling it family property, and I had to remind her that I had the receipts for every single piece. I told her that the family property was currently funding my new life in a city where people valued character over country club memberships. She hung up on me, but the victory was mine. I had stood my ground against the woman I used to fear most, and the world didn't end. That phone call was the final bridge I needed to burn. It wasn't just Justin I was divorcing, it was the entire suffocating culture of the perfect couple we had been forced to play. I went back to my drawings with a focus that was sharper than ever. My new boss, Elena, noticed. She was a woman who didn't waste words on small talk, but she walked by my desk that afternoon and tapped the edge of my drafting table. "You've got a good eye for the long view, Sarah," she said. "Most architects get bogged down in the facade, but you're looking at the foundation. That's how you build things that last." I realized then that I wasn't just building a community center for Austin. I was rebuilding the foundation of my own life. Every line I drew was a statement of independence. In Chicago, I was always the lawyer's girl who did a little drawing. In Austin, I was the architect people looked to for answers. Megan called me that night from a payphone near her apartment, her voice crackling with excitement. She told me that the social fallout in Chicago was even better than we had hoped. Apparently, Justin had tried to tell people that I was the one who had a breakdown and ran away, but the story didn't hold up. Tiffany had already been seen out with another guy, and when people started putting the pieces together, the break, the boxes at Barbara's house, the sold-off wedding, Justin's carefully crafted image as the perfect, wronged fiancé began to crumble. Megan told me that several of our mutual friends had reached out to her, asking for my new number because they wanted to apologize for not seeing through him sooner. I told her to keep my number a secret. I didn't want apologies from people who only valued me when it was convenient. I wanted to be a mystery to them. I wanted them to remember me as the woman who disappeared into the night and left nothing but a bare floor and a locked door. There was something incredibly powerful about being a ghost in your own past. I spent that weekend officially erasing myself from Chicago. I called the utility companies and gave them my final meter readings. I closed the local gym membership. I even called the library to make sure I didn't have any overdue books. It was a methodical process of untying every knot. The last thing I did was call the post office to cancel the mail forwarding I had set up. I didn't want a single letter from my old life to follow me here. If someone really wanted to find me, they would have to work for it, and I knew Justin wouldn't. He was too lazy, too focused on his own ego to go on a cross-country search for someone he thought he already owned. By the time I hung up the phone for the last time that Sunday, Sarah from Chicago was officially gone. Living in Austin in 1991 felt like living in a different world. People here didn't care about what firm you worked for or what kind of car you drove. They cared about the music you listened to and whether you knew a good place for brisket. I started spending my Saturday mornings at the local farmers market, buying fresh peaches and listening to street musicians play the blues. I would sit on the grass, surrounded by people who were just living their lives without the constant need for performance, and I would feel a sense of peace that was almost physical. I was learning to be comfortable in my own company. I didn't need a man to validate my weekends or a social circle to tell me I was successful. I was Sarah. I had $20 in my pocket, a job I loved, and a whole city to explore. It was the most wealth I had ever felt. My professional life was blossoming just as quickly. Elena gave me more responsibility on the community center project, allowing me to lead the meetings with the neighborhood council. I remember the first time I stood up in front of a room full of Austin residents to explain my design for the courtyard. In Chicago, I would have been nervous, looking over my shoulder to see if Justin was nodding in approval. But here, there was no Justin. There was just the work. I spoke about light, about the way a space should breathe, and about the importance of a porch as a bridge between the private and the public. When I finished, an elderly man in a cowboy hat stood up and said, "Ma'am, I think you actually listened to what we wanted. That's a rare thing in an architect." That moment meant more to me than any praise I had ever received in the fancy boardrooms of Chicago, but the ghost of Justin still tried to haunt me. About a month into my new life, I received a package at the office. It was from Chicago, but it wasn't from Justin. It was from his father. Inside was a single typed letter and a check for $500. The letter was short and formal. It said that Justin was going through a difficult transition and that his father felt it was appropriate to settle the utility bill I had sent. He also added a line that said, "I always admired your work ethic, Sarah. I'm sorry things ended this way." It was the only moment of genuine humanity I had ever seen from that family. I looked at the check for a long time. It was a small sum, a tiny fraction of what I had lost in time and emotion, but it felt like a white flag. I didn't cash the check right away. I put it in my desk drawer as a souvenir of the world I had escaped. It was proof that I had won. Megan called me a few days later to tell me that Justin had finally moved out of Barbara's house. He had rented a small apartment near the courthouse, a place that Megan described as sad and beige. Apparently, he was trying to re-enter the dating scene, but his reputation preceded him. Every woman he met eventually heard the story of the fiancé who vanished, and it made him look desperate. He was no longer the catch of Chicago. He was the guy who got outsmarted by a quiet architect. Tiffany had moved back to New York, leaving him with nothing but his law books and his regrets. I listened to the news and realized that I didn't feel happy about his misfortune. I just felt nothing. He was a stranger to me now, a person I used to know in a life I no longer lived. I began to realize that the break he wanted was never about Tiffany. It was about power. He wanted to see if he could break me, if he could make me so desperate for his love that I would accept anything. He thought he was playing a game of cat and mouse, but he didn't realize that the mouse had already found a way out of the maze. My disappearance wasn't a tantrum. It was a revolution. By refusing to be an option, I had reclaimed my status as a person. I was no longer a backup plan. I was the architect of my own happiness. And that happiness was becoming more solid with every passing day. I had built a new life in Austin, one made of sunshine, hard work, and genuine connections. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I went for a walk around Lady Bird Lake. The sun was setting, turning the water into a sheet of gold, and the bats were starting to fly out from under the Congress Avenue Bridge. I stood there, watching thousands of tiny black shapes fill the sky, and I felt a profound sense of connection to the world. I wasn't alone. I was part of the rhythm of the city. I thought about the woman I had been in Chicago, the one who was always checking her watch, always worrying about Justin's mood, always trying to be perfect. She seemed like a character in a movie I had seen a long time ago. The woman standing on the bridge in Austin was different. She was stronger, quieter, and much more at peace with her own shadows. I had started to make a few friends in Austin, mostly other architects and artists I met through work. We would get together on Friday nights at a small bar on 6th Street, drink cheap beer, and talk about the future of the city. There was a man named David who often joined us. He was a landscape designer, a quiet guy with a dry sense of humor and a deep knowledge of native Texas plants. He didn't try to impress me with his career or his car. He just talked about the way certain grasses changed color in the fall. We started taking long walks through the botanical gardens, talking about our favorite buildings and our dreams for the future. It wasn't a romance yet, but it was a friendship built on mutual respect, something I had never had with Justin. I remember one Saturday afternoon, David and I were sitting on a bench overlooking the hills. He asked me why I moved to Austin so suddenly. I told him the truth, but I kept it simple. I said I was in a relationship that made me feel small, and I decided I wanted to be big. He didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer any pity. He just nodded and said, "Austin is a good place for people who want to be big. There's a lot of room to grow here." That was it. No judgment, no drama, just an acknowledgement of my agency. In that moment, I knew I was finally safe. I was in a place where my past didn't define me, but my courage did. As the months turned into a year, Chicago became a distant memory. I still talked to Megan once a week, but our conversations were less about Justin and more about her own life. She had finally quit the job she hated and started her own photography business. We were both growing, both moving forward. Justin, according to the last update I got, had been passed over for partner at his firm. Apparently, his personal issues had started to affect his work, and the firm decided they wanted someone more stable. It was the ultimate irony. He had wanted to explore his options, and in doing so, he had lost the one thing he valued most, his professional prestige. He had gambled his future on a whim, and he had lost everything. I, on the other hand, had gained everything. My project for the community center was completed, and it became a landmark in the neighborhood. People loved the courtyard I had designed, the way the light hit the stone and the way the porch felt like a warm embrace. At the opening ceremony, Elena stood next to me and said, "You didn't just build a center, Sarah. You built a community." I looked at the families playing in the courtyard, and I felt a sense of fulfillment that no wedding could ever have given me. I was Sarah the architect, and I had left my mark on the world. I was no longer a ghost, I was a creator. The planned disappearance was complete. I had successfully erased the woman Justin thought he knew and replaced her with someone he would never understand. I had moved through the fire of betrayal and come out on the other side with my dignity intact and my spirit renewed. I looked at the Texas horizon, the sun sinking behind the hills, and I knew that the best was yet to come. I had built a foundation that was solid, a life that was mine, and a future that was wide open. The windy city was 1,000 miles away, and its cold breath could no longer reach me. I was home. My story isn't just about a breakup. It's about the moment a person decides that they are worth more than the crumbs someone else is willing to give them. It's about the power of the word no. By saying no to Justin's break, I had said yes to myself. I had chosen a path of uncertainty and hard work over a path of comfortable humiliation. And every single day since then, I have been grateful for that choice. The silence of my first nights in Austin wasn't a sign of emptiness. It was the sound of a new world being born. And in that world, I was the only architect that mattered. I was Sarah, I was free, and I was finally, truly, big. The night air in Austin was sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine as I walked back to my studio. I felt a lightness in my step that I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just a survivor, I was a winner. I had taken a moment of profound disrespect and turned it into the ultimate victory. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I thought about the note I had left on that door in Chicago. I wondered if it was still there, or if the new tenants had painted over it. It didn't matter. The words were written in my heart now. I had learned that you don't find your worth in the eyes of others. You build it with your own hands. And I had built something beautiful. The journey was long, and the path was steep, but the view from here was incredible. I was Sarah, and my life was just beginning. The breakfast in Austin on that 31st morning had the taste of a silent victory and fresh coffee that filled the warm Texas air in my small studio. I was sitting by the open window, watching the morning light hit the oak trees outside. And for the first time in a month, I didn't feel that sharp knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest since that dinner in Chicago. I knew, with a kind of mathematical precision, that at this very moment, Justin was driving back toward what he thought was still our home, completely unaware that I no longer existed in his reality. There was no malice in this thought, only a profound sense of poetic justice being served. I imagined his car cruising down the Kennedy Expressway, his mood likely cocky, thinking he had played his cards perfectly and was about to collect his prize for my supposed loyalty. But while he was moving toward the past, I was already walking into my future, with my boots dusty from a construction site and a heart lighter than it had been in 4 long years. Back in Chicago, the scene must have been worthy of a stage play, but without the happy ending he expected. Megan told me everything later, with a level of detail that made me realize how much the city itself had participated, almost unintentionally, in my personal revolution. Justin arrived at the loft around 10 in the morning. He parked his car illegally in a commercial zone, careless as always, and stepped out with a massive bouquet of red roses he'd probably bought at a gas station on the way, convinced that a few petals and a charming smile would erase the insult of his test. He walked toward the front door of the building with that confident lawyer stride, but the first glitch in his plan appeared immediately. His key wouldn't turn in the deadbolt of the main entrance. The building manager, a no-nonsense guy who didn't like drama, had followed my instructions to the letter and updated the access codes and keys for the unit since the lease was officially terminated. Justin stood there for a moment, jiggling the keys, convinced it was just a sticky lock or a minor inconvenience. He tried again and again, getting more frustrated with every failed turn, until Artie, the old concierge who had always been a fan of mine, stepped out of his small office in the lobby. Megan said Artie looked at him with a mix of pity and disgust, the kind reserved for people who have lost everything without even noticing. Justin, true to his arrogant nature, demanded to know why his key didn't work. Artie, without blinking, told him that Sarah had moved out 2 weeks ago and that the owner had taken back possession of the unit. He told him there was no one left on that floor and that he wasn't authorized to let him in. Justin turned beet red. He started shouting that it was his apartment, that his belongings were in there, and that Artie was overstepping. But Artie, with the calm of a man who had seen generations of tenants come and go, reminded him that his name was never on the lease and that legally he was nothing more than a guest who had decided to leave on his own accord. That was the moment the facade began to crack in front of the neighbors and passers-by who, curious about the shouting, started looking out of their windows. Not wanting to give in to public humiliation, he managed to slip in when a neighbor was entering and ran up the stairs, nearly tripping over the marble steps. When he reached our door, the final blow was even harder. The door wasn't just closed, it was different. The lock cylinder was brand new, a shiny silver that seemed to mock him. He started pounding on the door, calling my name with a voice that shifted from anger to a desperate plea. "Sarah, open up! I know you're in there! I'm home, Sarah!" he yelled into the silent hallway. But the only answer he got was the echo of his own voice bouncing off the bare walls of the corridor. Finally, he looked down and saw the note. It was a white sheet of paper, taped carefully, right at eye level, just as I had planned. Megan confirmed that he stood there staring at it for several minutes, motionless, while the red roses slowly slipped from his hand and fell to the floor, forgotten. On the note, I had written only a few words, but they were final. "Justin, I hope your exploration was useful in helping you understand who you are. As for me, I've understood who I don't want to be. Don't look for me, don't call me, and don't try to return to a place that no longer exists. Your things are at your mother's, and your dignity is somewhere I can't help you find. Goodbye, Sarah." Those words were the definitive closing of an era. There were no insults, no tearful explanations. There was only the acknowledgement of a void he had created himself. While he was realizing the scale of the disaster, I was walking onto the community center site in Austin. The cedar-scented air was thick with the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh lumber. It was a symphony of progress that made me feel like I was part of something alive and meaningful. David met me near the foundation with a roll of blueprints and a smile that gave me an immediate sense of calm. He didn't ask me about my past, but looking me in the eyes, he said I looked like I had finally found my center. We spent the morning discussing the layout of the native garden in the courtyard. I was so immersed in my work, the measurements, the drainage plans, the choice of limestone for the walls, that the drama in Chicago felt like it was happening on another planet. A story read in an old sociology textbook about a civilization that had long since collapsed. Justin, meanwhile, didn't give up immediately. Megan told me he spent the rest of the day trying to track me down through every possible contact. He even went to my old architecture firm in Chicago, convinced he'd find me there, perhaps at my drafting table with eyes red from crying. He walked in with the air of a man trying to resolve a misunderstanding, but the principal partner, a man who valued integrity above all else, received him with a glacial coldness. He told Justin that I no longer worked there and that my professional moves were private. When Justin tried to push, raising his voice and demanding to know where I had gone, the partner had the receptionist escort him to the door, telling him that the time for demands had ended, along with the respect he had failed to show his fiancé. The professional humiliation was perhaps what hit him the hardest. Justin lived for his image, for his reputation, for that social esteem you earn with titles and expensive suits. Finding himself rejected, not only personally, but socially and professionally, was an unsustainable shock for him. Megan told me that within a few days, the news of his behavior had reached the senior partners at his own law firm. The older lawyers, the ones who still believed in the value of a man's word, started looking at him with a mix of mockery and disappointment. Tiffany, in the meantime, had disappeared again. I knew, through the usual grapevine, that their test at the lake house had been a total failure. She wasn't looking for a broken and insecure man. She was looking for the idea of a forbidden romance, and when the forbidden became a daily reality of nervousness and regret, she had hopped on the first plane out of town, leaving him alone with his cardboard boxes at his mother's house. In Austin, I was starting to explore new places. One evening, David took me to a small outdoor concert in a park. We sat on a blanket, listening to a local band play blues under a canopy of stars. We talked for hours about how architecture should respect the soul of the people who live in it. I felt heard, understood, and valued, not for how I looked on the arm of a man, but for the solidity of my ideas and the precision of my technical vision. David didn't try to fill my silences. He simply walked beside me, respecting my need for independence. I was beginning to understand that love isn't a test or a break, but a continuous construction made of noble materials like truth and mutual respect. There was no need to explore anything else when you had a person looking at you with that kind of honesty. I received a phone call from Barbara, Justin's mother, a few nights later. Her voice was broken, stripped of that aristocratic smugness that used to define her. She told me Justin hadn't left his room in days, that he was obsessively looking at our old photos, and that he was even talking about resigning from his firm out of shame. She begged me to write him a letter, even just to say I forgave him, claiming his state of mind was concerning. I replied with a firmness I didn't know I had. I told her that forgiveness isn't a debt you pay to ease someone else's conscience, but a journey I was taking for myself, not for him. I explained that Justin needed to face the consequences of his actions in order to grow, and that any intervention from me would only prolong his illusion of being able to control others. He's a grown man, Barbara. I gave him exactly what he asked for, space. Now he has to learn how to live in it, I said, before hanging up. That conversation made me realize how much I had changed in such a short time. Only 2 months earlier, I would have cried hearing those words. I would have felt guilty for his suffering and likely would have given in to the desire to comfort him. But now, looking at the Texas horizon, I felt only a profound distance. It was as if I were looking at a construction site I had abandoned because the foundations were rotten. It didn't matter how much plaster I put on the walls. The building was going to collapse anyway. Justin hadn't lost me. He had lost the image of himself reflected in my unconditional love. And now that the mirror was shattered, he could no longer recognize his own face. I began to plan my first solo trip. I wanted to go to the coast, to see the Gulf of Mexico, and let the salt air wash away the last of the Chicago soot. I had saved enough money, thanks in part to the smart sale of the furniture, and I felt the need to breathe in a wider world. I mentioned it to David, and instead of offering to go with me or acting hurt that I wanted to go alone, he encouraged me with genuine enthusiasm. He gave me a list of small towns and hidden beaches that weren't too touristy. That reaction was the final confirmation that I was on the right path. A man who truly loves you doesn't fear your freedom. He celebrates it. Megan came to visit me for a long weekend in Austin. We spent the time hiking the Greenbelt and eating barbecue at a place that didn't even have indoor seating. She told me I looked like a different person. She said my posture was different, that my eyes had a light in them that had been missing for years. "You escaped the cage, Sarah," she said with a grin. And she was right. Justin thought he was asking for a break to reflect on himself, but he had actually given me the space I didn't know I needed to realize I didn't want to be a supporting character in someone else's movie anymore. That realization was the most powerful thing I had ever owned. The Sunday evening after I dropped Megan off at the airport, I walked around the lake by myself. The city was wrapped in a golden light, and the air was sweet with the scent of cedar. I stopped on the bridge to watch the sunset. The water was a sheet of gold, moving constantly toward the horizon. It reminded me that life always moves forward, regardless of the dams we try to build. Justin had been a dam in my life, an obstacle that tried to stop my flow. But now that I had moved past him, I felt myself flowing toward the open sea with an unstoppable force. I was no longer the betrayed fiancé or the architect in training. I was Sarah, and the world was full of possibilities again. As I walked back to my studio, I thought about the final balance of that month of taking a break. Justin had gotten his exploration and had found only a void. I had gotten the space I didn't know I wanted and had found myself. It had been a fair trade in the end. Everyone had received what they truly needed, even if he didn't know it yet. I walked into my home and didn't turn on the light immediately. I just stood there watching the shadows of the trees dance on the walls. It was a harmonious silence, full of promise. I knew that the next day at the site, we would start pouring the concrete for the main courtyard, bringing stability to a project that was finally becoming real. It was exactly what I had done with my soul. I had removed the rotten parts, reinforced the supports, and now I was ready to build even higher. Justin was a closed chapter in a book I had stopped reading. I didn't feel anger anymore, only a slight melancholy for the woman I used to be and a massive excitement for the woman I was becoming. I knew there would be other men, other challenges, and other mistakes, but I also knew I would never again let anyone put me on hold. My life wasn't a waiting room. It was a first-class journey where I was the only pilot in control. I fell asleep to the sound of a light rain hitting the roof, feeling safe in my new world, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, knowing that whatever it was, I would be able to face it with my head held high. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, I found an old postcard from Chicago in the back of a drawer. It was a picture of the skyline at night that we had bought together during our first year. I looked at it for a second, remembering the excitement of those early days and the feeling of warmth I used to get just from being near him. For a split second, I felt a tiny pang of nostalgia, but it was as brief as a sigh. I knew that the city I remembered was gone, just as the woman I used to be was gone. I tore the postcard into small pieces and dropped them into the trash, without any anger, just with the awareness that it was time to make room for new images and new sensations. Life in Austin was waiting for me, and I had no intention of making it wait a single second longer. Every moment gained in freedom was a moment stolen from regret, and I had already paid enough debts to the past to finally live my present with all the enthusiasm I could muster. I realized that the break he wanted was actually the door to my freedom. He thought he was holding the keys, but I was the one who walked through and locked it behind me. As I walked out into the Texas sun, I felt the warmth on my face and knew that the construction was finally underway. I wasn't just building a community center. I was building a life that was entirely my own. And for the first time, the blueprints were perfect. I was Sarah, the architect of my own happiness, and the foundation I had laid was solid enough to last a lifetime. Justin was just a ghost in a city I used to live in, and ghosts can't follow you across state lines if you don't let them. I was free, I was whole, and I was finally home. And that excitement did not fade with the end of that first summer in Austin. Instead, it became the fuel for every single action I took in the years that followed. Life in Texas had taken on its own rhythm, a vibrant and vital beat that seemed determined to erase every trace of the stagnation I had lived through in Chicago. The Community Center project was much more than just a professional success. It was the foundation on which I rebuilt my identity as a woman and as an architect. When the final inspection was passed and the building was open to the public, I felt an emotion I had never known back in the Midwest. It wasn't pride in a hollow way, but a deep peace, the satisfaction of having transformed the dust of the past into a solid and lasting structure that served the people. Justin was no longer anything more than a distant shadow, a memory that faded as I soaked in the light of my new life. David was there by my side on the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He didn't try to take credit for my work. He didn't try to shine in my place or talk over me during the press interviews. He simply looked at me with that immense respect that had become the engine of our relationship, a silent but powerful engine that allowed us to move forward together without ever hindering each other. The echoes that reached me from Chicago were fewer and further between, like the last rumbles of a storm that is finally moving away for good. Megan wrote to me a few months after I had permanently settled into my new firm to give me the latest news on what she called the total collapse of Justin. He had finally left his mother Barbara's house, but not to return to his former prestige or to start his social climb again. He had moved into a small, impersonal two-bedroom apartment near the courthouse in a less desirable neighborhood. His career, which had once been so promising, was completely stagnant. Word around the Chicago legal circles was that the once brilliant lawyer had become a nervous, distracted man, haunted by the image of that empty loft he had found one autumn morning. As for Tiffany, she had left for other horizons as soon as she realized that Justin was no longer the trophy she imagined, but a man broken by his own foolishness. His punishment was not a sudden tragedy, but a slow erosion of his ego, a loneliness chosen by default because he had not known how to cherish loyalty when it was right in front of him. My father called me one winter evening to tell me that he had run into Justin by chance on Michigan Avenue. He described a man who looked prematurely aged, huddled in an overcoat that was too big for him, who avoided my father's gaze before crossing the street. My father had no hatred for him, just that quiet indifference of someone who knows that justice has been served. He told me that Chicago seemed smaller now that I wasn't there, but that my success in Austin was the pride of the family. Hanging up the phone, I realized that I didn't even feel satisfaction hearing these stories anymore. Justin's fall didn't bring me anything more than my own rise did. I had passed the stage of revenge to reach the stage of indifference, and that was my greatest victory. The break he had imposed on me had been the soil of my own freedom, and for that, in a way, I could almost thank him. If he hadn't shown me his true colors so brutally, I might have wasted another 10 years trying to be enough for a man who would never value me. In 1993, I officially opened my own architecture firm in Austin. It was a huge leap of faith, especially in a field that was still very male-dominated at the time, but I had the strength of someone who had nothing left to prove to others, only to herself. I invested the savings I had managed carefully. I transformed an old warehouse into a creative space bathed in natural light, and I started designing homes that were sanctuaries, places where people could be themselves without having to wear a mask. My professional reputation grew quickly, not because I was someone's fiancé, but because my plans were precise, my visions were bold, and my management of construction sites was impeccable. Every contract I signed was another brick in the building of my independence. I no longer needed to ask for permission to exist. I created my own space. I worked on projects that focused on the community, on the environment, and on the human experience. I was no longer Sarah, the accessory. I was Sarah, the architect. David and I got married a few years later, without a big fuss, in a simple ceremony in the garden of our new home. There were no gas station roses bought at the last minute, no promises of tests or breaks. There was only the sincere commitment of two adults who respected each other deeply. Megan was there, of course, beaming to see that her friend had finally found the harbor she deserved. We didn't need to put on a show for the gallery. Our happiness was private, solid, built on foundations that we took the time to check every single day. Justin belonged to another life, to another Sarah that I no longer recognized. I had learned that love is not negotiated, and that it should never be a source of insecurity. It is a partnership, not a power struggle. David taught me that a real partner wants you to be big, not small. Today, in 2026, I sit here on my porch at 63 years old, looking at the hills of this city that saved me. My hair has turned to silver, and my hands bear the marks of years spent drawing lines and touching stone. But my heart is the same as that girl who took the train from Chicago with a single suitcase. David is inside making coffee, and the smell takes me back to that morning 35 years ago. Life has been generous to me, but it was because I had the courage to say no when I was offered less than what I was worth. If I had stayed in Chicago, if I had docilely accepted that ridiculous and humiliating break, I would have become a dull woman, a shadow trapped in a marriage of appearances. Instead, I chose the uncertainty of the journey, and that uncertainty gave me the most beautiful of rewards: peace of mind and the knowledge that I am the master of my own fate. Sometimes I think back to that evening in the restaurant in Chicago. I see Justin again with his smug look. I still feel the cold, damp wind of the city on my face. But these memories no longer hurt me. They are like the plans of a building that was ultimately not built because the ground was unstable. I regret nothing, not even the initial pain, because it was the engine of my revolution. Justin's break was the greatest service he ever did me, without even realizing it. He opened the door of my cage, and I had the intelligence to fly away without ever looking back. The void he found on his return was the fullness I was about to experience elsewhere. I realized that sometimes the worst things that happen to you result in the best outcomes. If he hadn't shown his true colors, I could have married him only to learn his genuine personality years later, possibly with children in the mix. Instead, I'm in a lovely city with a wonderful life. I know that there are many women listening to me today who are going through similar moments of doubt. Women who feel the weight of someone else's choice, crushing their hearts. Women who are asked to wait, to understand, to forgive the unpardonable in the name of a future that will never arrive. To you, I want to say that your dignity is not a subject for discussion. If someone treats you as an option, remove yourself from the list of choices. Do not stay in the wait for a verdict that depends on the whim of another. Your life is your construction site, and you are the one who must hold the reins. Sometimes you have to demolish everything to be able to rebuild something truly solid. Do not fear the silence or the void. That is where you finally hear yourself think, and where you discover your own strength. Life is too short to be someone's backup plan. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. My story ends here, between the smell of coffee and the sweetness of the Austin air. It has been a long road, sometimes painful, but every step was worth it to bring me exactly where I am now. I am no longer Sarah the fiancé. I am Sarah the free woman. Justin remained a rumor in my memory, an example of what I never want to tolerate again. Life taught me that self-respect is the only basis on which lasting happiness can be built. Now I am going to join David and savor this present that I have hard won, knowing that the future belongs entirely to me. I feel optimistic, grateful, and truly at peace. The anguish of betrayal has been replaced by thankfulness for the gunshot avoided. I walked away and made things better for myself, and you can do the same. I thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this part of my past that I have kept to myself for so many years. If my story has touched you or given you a bit of strength, do not hesitate to leave a like and subscribe to this channel to listen to more life stories like mine. Share this story with those you think might need it, because sometimes just knowing that someone else has made it is enough to find the courage to take the first step toward your own freedom. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to me from today? I like to imagine your lives and the places where my words reach. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me, and always remember, you are the only architects of your own destiny. Take care, and thank you for everything. This chapter of my life has officially ended, and I could not be more excited for the next one to begin. Thank you for being part of my journey today. I'll see you in the next story. God bless you all.